Mario Mendy as the head of the psychology department for this invitation, and Professor Martin Packer, who I have a colleague of long standing, and I'm discovering that in their work together and with other people here, very interesting research and teaching are going on. So I've had the pleasure of learning a lot since I got here, and I'm enjoying myself very much. Thank you for coming to hear this talk, and I'll look forward to questions when I get done talking. And maybe before we begin, how long should I talk, or when should I quit? You have a 45 minutes and something like that. Okay, I'll try to keep it there. The title I prefer for this talk is something like this: what is learning, and why should we care? These are questions for life in the world beyond our educational institutions. And here's what I think, that we all share a common sense, understanding of what learning is. And academic and official theories of learning, like our own, do not address how learning goes on in our lives outside of schooling. So neither our own intuitions nor the official theories that come in academic books are adequate to account for how learning takes place in the rest of our lives and the rest of the world. Our common sense understanding of learning, what we know about learning, is closely related to our experiences in going to school. Each person in this room, I think very likely, has had 10,000 hours of each of your lives has been spent in schools of one sort or another. And yes, so we are each deeply formed in our very bones by what it means to learn in school. And yet, schooling is an unusual and limited part of our lives. I give lots of talks and try to turn the focus away from what we mean by learning in school to what we mean by learning in other kinds of settings and situations. And I can tell you that it never lasts more than 5 minutes. By 5 minutes into a discussion, we're back talking about school. So I observe that we have a very difficult time talking about what we mean by learning and any other kind of setting than school. So it is difficult, really difficult to work out rich and interesting ways to see the rich and interesting learning practices in our everyday lives. It's really hard. And we ourselves, along with the academic theorists and theorizing about learning, we make it difficult. We're part of the problem because we're so deeply informed by our notions of learning as something that goes on in school. So in this talk, I'm going to do 2 things. One is that I want to lay out assumptions, the assumptions that underlie our common sense and official theory of learning. Later, I want to talk about how anthropologists and social psychologists have challenged these assumptions and tried to work out other ways of understanding learning. They raise good questions that I hope might be useful to you in other of the everyday circumstances of your lives. So that what I hope you go away from this talk with is the questions, and that you play with them as you go about your life in the next few days and see if it's possible to consider some things going on in your life as matters of learning that perhaps you didn't see that way before this afternoon. We'll see. You must report back. Send me email or something. Okay. Now, these assumptions that I want to lay out for you, I'm going to do in a very bold, blunt, simple way. And it would be easy to dismiss them as a caricature of what we think about learning. But instead, I'd like to argue and hope you would give me the benefit of the doubt that having looked very carefully for years at what these sort of deep assumptions are, I believe I'm giving you the benefit of my experience as a social theorist when I try to talk about what these assumptions are. I think we all hold them, but I think we don't often see them directly. What they do is to operate in a generative way, bubble up in many things we do and don't do in the world without thinking about why. So, here are some of the assumptions that I want to argue underlie the way we all think about learning. First of all, teachers are supposed to teach novices. That is, people who are, as we think about it, we think about the people who are supposed to learn as only having the characteristics of learners. They are only somebody ready to learn. We don't, at the same time, think of them as the many other things they are in their lives. So, teachers are supposed to teach novices, and without teachers, teaching novices, the novices won't learn. So, teaching is a prerequisite for learning. A teacher is someone who knows, teaching someone who does not know. Teaching and learning happen only in the situation in which teachers are doing it in classrooms. Yet learning, or really teaching, is supposed to have effects far beyond the face-to-face situations of teaching and learning in classrooms. That's what, trying to affect life after schooling is what teaching and learning in school are supposed to be for. That's their purpose, is to affect life in the world beyond the school. Indeed, theories of teaching and learning make elaborate assumptions about the impact of teaching and learning on the rest of the lives of students who go out into the world. But of course, teachers don't go out into that world with the students to see what happens, nor do researchers for the most part. For the most part, people who do research on teaching and learning confine it and believe that it's only going on and it only only matters in the situations in which teachers and learners are face to face together. We are talking about individuals who are supposed to learn about knowledge or information which is to be learned, and a social world into which knowledge and people are supposed to go. Those three things, the social world, people, and knowledge, we find very easy to think of any one of them separately from the other two. We don't have strong feelings that if you talk about one, you must talk about all three indivisibly. So our theory of learning is one which is comfortable about separating people, world, and knowledge. We do talk about individual students moving from school. They move out of school into the rest of their lives, carrying what they've learned with them. But nothing else moves. Only the knowledge goes out the door in the heads of the kids, and that movement of children out of the school with the knowledge is the only bridge to the rest of the world that is assumed in our understanding of learning. And that's called, in academic theory, learning transfer. And learning transfer is a major issue in certainly educational research. There are psychologist studies, and I think also in our understanding of what happens when we leave school ourselves. Now, there are things that our common theory of learning does not say or do, which are characteristic of that theory. Absences, silences. For one thing, for the most part, it has nothing to say about how learning takes place. And that may sound strange. But if you look closely at how much of research that says it's about learning, it actually turns out to be research on teaching. And we have the assumption, that goes back to that earlier assumption, that learning simply follows from teaching. So if you understand the teaching, you don't really need to find out anything more about the learning. It just automatically happens, or it should. And if it doesn't, why be interested in it anyway? That's failure. That isn't something about learning that you want to come to understand. Theories of learning are also silent, and I think we as sort of people who ourselves have gained our understanding, our theory of learning from going through schooling, this is an especially important point, that theories of learning are silent about the institutional arrangements of schooling that are essential if the way we say learning occurs is actually going to happen. However, these arrangements, the ways in which schools are organized, look at us. I'm standing up here facing me. You're sitting there in rows facing me. A lot of things are going on that are typical of this particular form of social practice, but are not typical of most of the rest of the world that we live in. These are institutional arrangements of schooling, and I think they are exotic, highly peculiar, very strange, and we ought to be astonished at them and surprised by them, and not take them as matters, take them for granted. These arrangements make classroom lessons possible, but if we imagine instead learning going on in practices with very different institutional arrangements, we need a theory of learning that does not depend on such arrangements in order to explain what learning is and how it takes place. There are some other lacks and limits, silences in the way we understand learning. For one thing, our theory about what learning is and how it comes about ignores the fact that every one of us has a number of specific contexts in which we live our lives, and that schooling is not the only one. Now, you know that, but when we talk about learning, we tend to act as if that's the only setting which matters for an understanding of what learning is. We also ignore, when we think about learning, that people are never novices in the conduct of their own lives. We are all partially knowledgeable participants in many different ways in the world, and we do not cut those off or leave them behind when we come into an institutional arrangement for learning. But our theory of learning acts as if they do not exist when we're talking about learning. And I think finally that our theory of learning, our ordinary everyday theory, does not lead us to address the fact that the contexts of people's lives, which include schooling, but many other contexts, those contexts are connected and also disconnected in historical, political, economic, social, and cultural ways. Further, people engaged in the conduct of their everyday lives move into and through and out of those contexts into and through other contexts as the very basis of the lives we lead. Okay, so that's where I think we begin. So now, what have anthropologists and social psychologists done over the years to respond to this critical view of our cultural account of learning with all its assumptions and limitations? A main point, and actually maybe for just a minute, I want to turn around this discussion to say that often people will say to me and other anthropologists who do things like the ethnographic research I have done, which has involved spending years in Liberia studying the craft of tailoring among Bai and Gola tailors and their apprentices. And they'll say, well, if you're really interested in education, if you're really interested in learning, why aren't you in schools, which is where real learning takes place and where it really matters? And the answer I would give is that starting out with the assumptions I've laid out for you, the work I've been trying to do all these years is to challenge each one of those assumptions on grounds that they don't give us a sufficiently rich, broad productive understanding of learning. So that my studies of apprenticeship in Liberia are aimed at challenging this theoretical formation that I brought to that enterprise and that I believe we share in good part, all of us, and which certainly informs official understandings of what learning is supposed to be about. So, not just me, but lots of other anthropologists and social psychologists have done some very peculiar and strange research projects which make, I think, better sense if you think of them as aimed at an inquiry into the sufficiency and validity of our everyday understandings of learning. It takes lots, it has taken me, but others as well, lots of years to figure out what some of the kinds of things are you might want to take seriously in challenging every one of the common sense assumptions we have all grown up with and come to inhabit as academics or as alumni of schooling. These have involved articulating, for one thing, and I think very importantly, articulating relations among persons' knowledge and the social world, and seeing those relations as changing. Indeed, that, heavens, why be interested in the idea of learning? Well, what better way, oh well, there are some, but it is one good way to think about change, to think about social change, to think about persons changing, to start out with the idea that we are all engaged in changing, and that somehow or other our ways of talking to ourselves and each other about the very changing character of our world and our persons is an important shift to be able to make in the way we try to understand things. So learning is a nice topic for pushing yourself to try and see people changing in the world as the way we are and the world is. Now, I think there are, or I thought I'd try to talk about 4 good issues for stirring up some new ideas about how to think about learning in places that are not like schools. The first, and so I'm going to take them one at a time. I sort of hope that if I count things and say 2 topics, 4 points, maybe it will be easier to get what I'm trying to say, given that we're trying to do this in goodness knows what linguistic circumstances. I might not always give talks this way, but I don't know, maybe, I hope that helps. 1. The first. There are, no, I'm going to start by telling you what the 4 are. 4 issues that I want to talk about. The first is, I think we need to stop thinking about learning as a matter of school. And the second is to stop thinking of learning as a matter of mental exercise. The third is to reconsider what we mean by knowledge or information. And the fourth is to revisit that concept of learning transfer, that concern about how knowledge travels from school into everyday life. So, the first. I'm going to do this as a series. I'm going to give you advice, and I'm going to suggest questions that you might want to ask for yourself on your own behalf. First of all, my very best advice is reject institutional assumptions that come from schooling. After all, very little of life is organized that way. So if learning is going on, it is going on in other institutional arrangements. Some of the things that you are unlikely to find any place but in school-like arrangements. One, mostly learners are not isolated or separated from the contexts in which they're going to be using what they're learning. That's one. Second, there are very often in the world no teachers where learning is going on. And if not, what is going on instead is a good question. There are never learners who know nothing. There are always learners who are partially knowing about stuff, and that is an important point. There are no classrooms in most of our lives, and they do not organize practices of learning. For the most part in life, there are no tests, no grades. People are not divided so that they're and segregated so that each group is exactly the same age. And then there's another group which is 1 year older, and then another 1 year older than that, and so on. That is how we go about in the world in general, living our lives. And, yeah, okay. So those are a few suggestions of things you're not likely to see in the world, but which we so often turn to when we think about learning. Here's a very quick example. I had a student who was doing research on in the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center in Palo Alto, California, and he was trying to study how people learn to be salespersons, to sell big copier machines. And he found that if he asked them, well, what do you need to learn to be a good salesman? That the only answer he could get was, well, I went to Xerox University for 3 weeks. We had classes every day, and I had to memorize the manuals for 5 different kinds of copiers. But that, look at that, as you say the word learn and somebody says school, right? He found he had to say to people, well, how did you get to be such a good copier salesperson? Before they began to recognize that as a question about the complex relations across contexts, the relations with people, their relations with clients, and much more, all of which were involved over a long period of time in coming to do well what it was they were trying to do. And I think that is not at all uncommon as a contrastive set of questions and ways of doing things. I thought I might start or tell you a little bit about the research I did in Liberia on craft apprenticeship among Bai and Gola tailors in the 1970s. I spent parts of 5 years there, spending a lot of time in the tailor shops, 20 tailor shops, wooden shacks, along a narrow dirt path at the very edge of the commercial district in Monrovia, Liberia. There were 100 master tailors and 150 apprentices. Again, as another way of illustrating how hard it is to see learning going on when it isn't being done with the institutional support reports of schoolish ways of doing things. When I first got there, I went and sat in a tailor shop, watching the tailors and the apprentices over a period of a week, and I could see that some apprentices were more skillful than other apprentices, but nobody, the master tailors, who I thought should be teachers, weren't teaching the apprentices. And I thought, maybe I come too late in the morning, I should get up earlier, or maybe something else is going on. And I finally asked one of the master tailors, would he please show me how he taught his apprentices? And this was a kind man, and so he sat his little apprentice down and sort of wagged his finger at him and explained things in a loud voice to the apprentice. And finally he ended by saying something which could only have been meant for my ears. He said to this little boy, and the fly always goes on the front of the trousers. Yes, do you get that? Okay. And I didn't cry till I left, but I walked home with tears running down my face and saying, oh my goodness, I do not understand. This is all wrong. I'm asking the wrong questions. It must not work that way. But what instead? Okay, and that's the question. Now you can see why I've been winding up with all these claims here. Because when you get into a situation where clearly lots of interesting and learning is going on that's important to everybody in the situation, but isn't being done by in a school-based model, it's very hard to come to understand what's going on instead. So, that's a long story, and I've just finished a book about it, so I'll just, sorry. It's called Apprenticeship in Critical Ethnographic Practice, and University of Chicago is publishing it. And there I've laid out in detail the process, which went on very like what I've just described. I'd make one step forward in understanding something, and then I would confront the fact that I was just banking on one of my old school-based assumptions yet again, and I would see that I didn't understand what was going on. And I'd back off and try to figure out, spend more time sitting there, watching and talking and asking questions, and gradually I think I came to learn a good deal about how it is that apprentice tailors learn to be master tailors in Monrovia, Liberia. Just to give you tiny examples of what I think I learned, for one thing, I made the observation, but if you read studies of craft apprenticeship, many observers make the same observation, that when you start to learn something like a craft of tailoring, you start at the end of the process and work your way back to the beginning, so that what you're doing isn't merely repeating what masterful people are doing. You're working in two ways at once. You start as a tailor's apprentice, learning to sew buttons on trousers and hem the cuffs. As you do that, you're spending a lot of time holding and feeling and looking at trousers, and it's not too surprising that the next thing you learn is how to sew the trousers. But when you sew trousers, you have pieces that have been cut out, And you come to understand the logic of how they go together as you sew them. And eventually, you learn to cut them out. And the other things you learn to do to be a tailor. So there are some interesting things about just the simple ideas about how people come to learn to do things. And I actually think there are many analogies in our own lives. And that one is, now there's one that's worth taking home and trying to think about. Also, most of what people learn, the little apprentices learn in those tailor shops is not from some formidable, stern master. You wouldn't want to ask him a question. You learn, think about your professors, right? How many of them, how many of them would you like to take a dumb question to? Now, dumb questions are important in life, but you don't want, you pick who you ask. So, I have this idea that most situated instruction, small things going on that make a huge difference in what you're able to do, come from being around near peers. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go somewhere. People who are a little more knowledgeable or able than you are, but not a lot. And it's in those relations that I think most changes in skill come about. I think that's true in universities as well. It's working with other students that you really come to learn a whole lot. And classes have their place, but treat very seriously those relations with other students. Also, masters. What is a master good for? If he doesn't teach you anything, and he just looks tough and goes around making trousers, well, I think masters are concrete exemplars of the kind of person you are coming to be as a master tailor. You've got to learn how to march down the street in your robes, looking, really dignified and proud of who you are and what you do. And you have to know who to flirt with, and who to, and much else in order to be a master tailor. That is part of what it means to learn to be a tailor. I've just read an article by Jorge about biologists and biology students, and he talks about biology professors in similar terms as being exemplars of what it means to do and be that sort of person. And so I think, again, that's something that is worth considering as a good part of our lives in many, many different contexts. And maybe one more thing, and then I'll move on. I think if you looked around a tailor shop and you were a new apprentice, not only were the masters kind of examples of what you were hoped to become, but apprentices with different degrees of knowledge and skill were concrete examples of the steps you would be going through as you went on to become a tailor. They were the concrete curriculum for people trying to come to learn things. And as you think about many activities in our everyday lives, think about families with children of different ages, think about sports teams, think about, there are many other ways in which I think we draw on each other, on our differences, to help us understand what to do next and where to go and what to expect. think in common sense ways about learning. We think about people as if they were lollipops, that is, heads on sticks, not bodies, not people who, let's see, do you get tired sitting at your computer? Of course you do. Do you think that's not embodied activity? No. It is. Everything we do is embodied, and embodied in important and ways that both make what we think of as mental activity what it is, and are affected by the practices we engage in. So here's some questions. What if thinking is embodied always, and bodily activities are always culturally, intellectually meaningful? So that you can't reduce mind to body or body to mind. And both are necessary for anything that we do in this world. So the notions that learning is school exercises or homework problems, and that's the model for what learning is, just isn't fun. It doesn't do what we need to do to think in more ample, interesting terms. What if what's learned isn't information or knowledge? That sounds all pretty mental, doesn't it? Somehow something is put into your head. You put it into your head. So maybe more thinking needs to go on, more work, more collaborative practice about what it is involved in coming to be able to engage in a practice which can never be reduced to only some body of information. So that's a good question. Here's another one. What if learning is not individual, but involves several people all at once? What happens? How does it happen? And I have Danish colleagues who are working on what happens on the building site for a new, very large construction project in Denmark, when people who are electricians and carpenters and steel workers and people of different trades have to coordinate with each other. They have to learn from each other how to get on to do what they have to do. And these interesting colleagues are talking about conflictual cooperation. The notion that people do go on together in ways that take the shape they do because they are conflictual and in tension with each other, and are ways of going forward together. Call that learning. Let's turn to the third question. Third issue. I think we tend to think about knowledge that's acquired in school-like settings as general knowledge, that when we take it out into the world, gets applied to particular situations. But suppose that, in fact, you can't say that schools are places where general learning takes place and other contexts are not. Supposing, and here you play, maybe all contexts of our lives are ones in which the practices we take part in are specific, particular, and complexly different from each other. That would then have to include learning situations in school, just like every other situation. And that, then, again, ought to raise some interesting questions about what's going on in relations between the different contexts of our lives as we come and go, as some things going on in one context are important, but in transformed ways than in some other context. And you never want to ask that question if you didn't ask symmetrically, how about what's going on here, and what kind of relations does it have with what's going on over here? So that the notion that goes along with a stance that starts in a classroom of teaching and learning and seems to run downhill from the general to the particular as a way of understanding what's going on. Universities are places which very often take that view of what they're teaching, general knowledge, and that's not itself a particular kind of situation. In fact, it is a highly particular kind of situation. So the relations between what goes on in the situations of learning in the university and what goes on in other contexts are complex, indirect, mediated, and in no way can you tell simple stories about traveling outside the university with your nice general head full of knowledge and sprinkling it around in the particular situations of your everyday life. So, supposing this is true, and it would change your understanding of how you want to look at relations between what goes on in a classroom setting, what goes on in other settings in your life in a much more symmetrical way, which would mean that learning transfer is a very inadequate concept. It's one-directional, right? It just says you take something with you from a classroom learning situation out. But this kind of way of thinking says, you need always to look symmetrically at the way what goes on in any pair of situations affects each other. So, it's time that I quit, so I was going to talk to you about, so what do you do about institutional arrangements where learning is clearly going on, but those arrangements are very different from schooling. Workplaces, for instance, or home, or other kinds of situations in your lives, but I've run out of time. I'll be glad to talk about it. I have notions that we need a language about institutional practices, institutional trajectories, some kinds of social institutions build in expectations about how and support those materially for moving through them. Most workplaces you have notions of you move from entry positions to more advanced ones, to managerial positions, and to retirement, to blowing out the door at the other end, right? That's a very simple one. But in that are huge changes in persons and practices, which are about what you want to think of as learning. So that's useful. And the other issue, the other kind of language I think might be helpful is to think people have personal trajectories into the context and through the context of their lives that aren't all the same. So how you, I don't know, engage in different kinds of settings with practices that may make assumptions that you should go this way, well, you go that way. Both of those things are possible, and they depend on how the context of practice and your participation in them come together and make each other. So that helps, I think. I don't know. The fourth issue, really, I'll be very brief and then I'll make some conclusions. I've come to think partly through the work of a colleague in Denmark, Ulla Dreyer, who is a critical social psychologist, that we need to think of people always as engaged in the conduct of their everyday lives, and that means we're always very basically in motion. The trouble with classrooms like this is that we create the illusion that people typically sit still, that we don't move, that when important things are happening, it's because we've stopped, we've sat down here, whatever. Whereas if we really wanted to understand what was going on in this room, we would want to know where each of you came from. What happened? How did you come? You're going through here. You're not here. You're on your way from somewhere that you've come from on to something else, somewhere else, other things in your lives. And trying to then take that seriously as the basic condition of our lives changes the way I think that you look at people's changing engagements in the changing practices of their lives. All right, conclusions. When I think about all of the many, many efforts of which I have hardly touched on to work out different ways of understanding learning, I'd say there are two reasons why this matters deeply to me. One is political. No doubt, any theoretical perspective can be enlisted to justify and defend a highly unjust and unequal status quo. And I think that official theorizing about learning, more often than not, does just that. Common sense official assumptions have been employed in ways that are central to the social formation in which we live, with fateful consequences for many members of our societies for a very long time. At the very least, it seems useful to me to try on a theoretical perspective that challenges and holds in tension our current ways of understanding learning. The way I do that is one among a number of possible ways. But whatever way you choose to take a critical stance with respect to our understandings of learning, and to the extent that you're psychologists or people in fields of education, you have particular responsibilities to really dig deeply at the basic assumptions that, in fact, underpin the ways in which we allow schooling and our understandings of learning and teaching to just make it easy to let the world divide into those who can and those who can't, those who have and those who don't, and to a bunch of different ways. And so I think these issues are worth taking seriously and critically. The second reason why what I've been talking about matters deeply to me is that I think we have been had by, by a single institution, with a single dimension of life in a single universal theory of learning, and that is just too frustrating. There is so much going on about which this keeps us ignorant, but it is also the case that everyone here knows from other aspects of their lives deep and interesting things about learning, but you never get to talk about them or think about them or do anything about them because we don't have a language, we don't have permission, we don't have ways of coming to put our finger on what those interesting, exciting ways of learning are. It seems to me that we should not be bound in our lives by that paradox, that the official way we all easily talk about learning is entirely inadequate to the topic of deep concern, and that our deep concerns and knowledge and understanding of learning in other settings is very, very difficult to bring to bear, either on our own lives or on official and common sense knowledge of learning. Now, I don't know if all of the things I've talked about have sounded more like a list of ideas than a coherent frame of or perspective for thinking about learning. But in fact, they come out of a perspective I've been working and trying to develop with colleagues over many years. And I would say that to talk about learning is to talk about changing relations between people and the world. When you start with that relation, the relation of changing persons in the world, the task, then notions of relational theory, of situated practice, of situated learning, don't look so difficult, maybe, because they are relations. And our task is not to take them apart and say, I'll talk about knowledge, I'll talk about persons, I'll talk about the world, but to start with the given fact that they are relations, and then to ask what that implies about other things in the world. Persons are changed by their participation in everyday practices. Practices are changed by the participants who are themselves part of those practices, partly changing themselves, partly changing as part of practice. The notion of changing participants in changing practice, read from many different angles, is how I've come to think about learning. Somebody's got to tell me which of these I should turn off. But I have to see this. I'm completely confused. Okay. Right.
Muchas gracias, maestra, por la conferencia. Muy importante. Tengo dos preguntas. Qué pena con usted. Para usted, maestra, el aprendizaje autónomo y práctico es más importante y esencial que el aprendizaje intelectual, formal de conocimiento, cognitivo, en la vida cognitiva del individuo, del ser humano. Digamos, me explico. Para ti, cuando planteas los ejemplos, esa transferencia de conocimiento, de aprendizaje de la vida, de esa comparación que haces o que planteas entre el conocimiento formal, académico, con el aprendizaje de la vida real, es mucho más enriquecedor, mucho más importante, mucho más esencial para el ser humano. Desde el punto de vista.
No, I would say they're not different.
No, yo capté. Digamos, hay una tesis muy importante que, digamos, voy a tratar de sintetizar. Es que, digamos, la trayectoria personal del aprendizaje del individuo es mucho más rica que un aprendizaje académicamente formal.
So,
Discúlpeme.
I think that in any institution, I gotta take this off. Look, there are many kinds of social institutions, all of which, in one way or another, if they're going to go on over time, have to reproduce themselves and their participants. And how this, in part then, every participant in any institution, and I would not exclude schools, universities, I just don't want to distinguish among them in this regard. Participants have personal trajectories into and through them, and these are different for different participants. To me, what goes on in an institution like a university involves just as specific and complex and worthwhile kinds of engagement in changing practice as in any other institution. We then probably need to introduce politics and to say that the cultural capital that you take away with you from your personal trajectory through the institutional trajectories of the university may be of greater economic value in a capitalist society than your passage through, for instance, participation in the Catholic Church, which also is an institution with institutional trajectories, and also all participants have personal trajectories through that institution. Many important and rich kinds of changes happen for people in either both. They're different from each other. They may be of different political and economic value, but it is not because what constitutes or what we call knowledge in one is somehow of intrinsically greater value than what goes on in, what's the name of the Bogota football club and its trajectories. Well, it's really a plea for analysis of what goes on in every single institution in our society, both as a kind of practices in which learning is an important, useful way to look at what's going on, though not the only way, but also a plea not to give in to what I see as an ideology of education in the society in which we live, that ascribes on abstract general principles more value and power to certain kinds of identified educational activities than to other activities. That doesn't mean that in certain contexts, some kinds of able skill are more of value than in others. But what it does is trying to say, don't make an exception. If you want a general theory of learning, you can't exclude schools and universities as a special case. You certainly shouldn't say that the special case you decided on, schooling, should then be used as the standard for measuring learning in every other part of your social world. And the best way to do that is to take a possibly counterintuitive view that whatever's going on in that football club or the Catholic Church, that the way you go about analyzing it as practices of learning is equally applicable to what is going on in schools and universities. And this kind of analysis is not usually applied, but it ought to be, if you agree with me, right across the board, no exceptions. The political conclusions you draw from that are whatever you draw, but the analytic work you do ought to be even-handed. Is what I'm saying.
Eso es lo que estoy diciendo, es que todas las instituciones son sitios de
Hola. La verdad no sabría mucho por dónde empezar, porque pues me ha tocado de muchas formas la conversación. Tengo un revoltijo en la cabeza, pero más o menos podría decir. Vengo sintiendo que como estudiante de antropología han sido de alguna forma u otra retratar la vida y veo tantos obstáculos de alguna forma u otra en la academia o en la forma en que se hace la misma antropología. Y pues eso desanima mucho, porque es que, bueno, es como... Creo que lo que tú planteas, de alguna forma u otra, plantea algo esencial en la antropología, y es la forma en que se hace. Se me hace que los modelos y las mismas teorías se alejan mucho de la misma realidad. Hay muchas formas de transmitir conocimiento por fuera de las aulas, ya sea a través, por ejemplo, tengo una, bueno, antes de leer, antes de entrar a la conferencia, estaba leyendo algo de Carlos Castaneda. Ajá. Y,
Really?
sí.
All right.
Bueno, y es ese asunto como de... Hay un momento en la historia que queda como un tonto, porque se aleja mucho de la misma... no sé si ya estoy extendiendo mucho la pregunta. Sí.
I actually know Carlos Castaneda.
Yo conozco personalmente a Carlos Castaneda.
Si me dan permiso, entonces sigo acá. Sí, hay una parte del libro en que, bueno, es el comienzo del libro, y don Juan se molesta mucho con Carlos por la cantidad de preguntas que se le hacen absurdas. De alguna forma u otra le está tratando de transmitir algo que va mucho más allá de la racionalidad del conocimiento, y es palpar la existencia de formas que llegan a sentir con la piel, no sé, es otro tipo de muchas formas de dimensionar la realidad. Y pues no sé, como antropóloga y tocando el tema pues del aprendizaje, que termina siendo lo más básico de la vida humana, la experiencia. Sí, como me es muy que las aulas transmiten algo que no, me perdí. Las aulas bueno, parecen segregar de la misma existencia, bueno, parece separarla totalmente. No sé si estoy siendo... Y bueno, llegó a algún tipo de ideologías o algún tipo de planteamiento teórico, ya sea la fenomenología o las teorías orientales, que de alguna forma se nacen que recalcan mucho eso de la misma existencia, de estar presente. Y le he encontrado mucho más pasión a eso que a los mismos libros que me hacen acumular en la universidad. No sé.
Yeah, yes. Let's see, I could take this one. One of the things I like from the time I spent with those tailors in Liberia is exactly the point I was making about through my own work and also through Professor Jorge's work, that knowledge is not something one acquires. What we call knowledge, and of various kinds, it needn't be the kind of, again, not the image of school knowledge, but other forms and kinds of knowledge, is subsumed in becoming different kinds of persons in the world. So, remember when I said you have to learn to become a master tailor by having the concrete example of the master being a master tailor in the buy and Angola world. We've all been playing, experimenting with notions of identity, and the notion that somehow who you are becoming is what learning is about, and the stuff we call knowledge or knowledges or kinds of modes of being in the world are part of that, but their meaning and the place they have doesn't exist independently of persons. It is part of persons, only a part of persons, and whatever it comes to mean is as part of persons acting in the world. And so I think it's two things are true about learning social theory as an anthropologist. One is that you're being exposed to anthropologists for whom that's their way of being an anthropologist in the world, and they're there for you to come to take on or consider what you're learning in terms of becoming that kind of person, or not. Maybe you don't want to do that. The other thing is, and I'm not sure this is an answer, but it's something I want to say, which is that I have a profound belief that it is in the discipline of social theory that we have the possibility of finding ways to take a critical and different kind of view of the world in which we live and of which we're a part. I couldn't talk the way I do about issues of learning if I were doing so from within the theoretical perspective we all arrive at the anthropology department with. It's been a huge amount of work to come to see in what I would call a theory of praxis, a theory of social praxis, a critical, historical, materialist, theoretical perspective. And that's enormously important to me. Part of why it's so important is that it was part of the process by which I stopped being an anthropologist who was contributing to this kind, the kind of educational anthropology. I don't know what you know about the anthropology of education, but for the most part, it makes me as depressed as you feel about things going on in anthropology. And so I don't think it's depressing because you're hearing social theory as abstract, general, rationalist. I guess I shouldn't say the word that I think follows that. It's because there is a possibility of digging deeper into the assumptions underlying the way we, as anthropologists, look at the world, that I think it's of value. It's a anthropologists, maybe more than anything, hope to fight their way through and against what we call ethnocentrism, right? I consider social theory a means for doing that. But it takes lots of kinds. And
yo soy antropólogo y, bueno, partiendo, por ejemplo, de los siguientes supuestos de que el ser humano es el único animal que es capaz de producir símbolos. Durante mi experiencia etnográfica estudiando comunas en Medellín me he dado cuenta, por ejemplo, que dependiendo del nivel educativo, y me refiero a que la gente puede estudiar, pero otra cosa es educarse, dependiendo del nivel educativo, las personas o los seres humanos adquieren una mayor o menor capacidad de abstraer sobre el símbolo o sobre el signo como tal. En ese sentido, tú hablabas de la importancia que tiene el cuerpo en cuanto al aprendizaje. ¿Qué tanto te refieres tú a las emociones y la mímesis dentro de ese tipo de fenómeno?
absolutely. Yeah, good point. Actually, look at how I limited what I talked about within the schoolish world by leaving out the things you're talking about. Thank you.
Si usted pudiera reinventarse las instituciones educativas, ¿cómo lo haría?
If you were going to remake the educational institutions, how would you do it?
I refuse to answer questions so absurd that and I'm not making fun of you. It's of course it's something we all care about. We cannot make the institutionalized system of education in the social society in which we live. We can, of course, think about how to try to make things differently, but then it's really a question about how do you fight over one generation, 2 generations, 6 generations to bring about change. And so I would be more interested in talking about what are the next steps in fighting, in struggling to try and change things, in educational possibilities for everybody, the quality and deep knowledgeability and joy and pleasure in knowing things in the world and being able to do things. I tried to make a step myself. I went to I'm an anthropologist, but I went to a graduate school of education at the University of California at Berkeley and started a new PhD program there in critical, social, and cultural studies in education. I believe that the people who went through that program came away with social theoretical sophistication, a very critical analysis of the effects of public schooling in the United States and its historical shifts going on now into private schools, charter schools, other ways of destroying public schooling in our country, privatization and so on, and are working as hard as they can to try and bring about change. Saying that, I have lots of thoughts about how really great learning does take place and what helps to make it possible. And it's like you're asking me to tell, you know, the history of the world in 2 sentences, and I really can't do that, but I'd be delighted to talk to you and anyone else afterwards. I think you have to say the phenomenon of interest isn't teaching, it's learning. And that to do that, you follow learners. When I hang out in this school of education, they say they're studying learning. And I say, good, what are you going to study? And they say, I'm going to study teachers teaching. No, that won't do. There are a number of things you can do to change.